there's gonna be 5 speakers in this like hour and a half session. So we had all talked before, we're gonna do 12-minute presentations, they're pretty short, and then have like a good 5-minute chunk for questions at the end. And we'll go for those online, we'll just go in the order that it says in the app. I don't know if you guys saw that. I'll just read it out loud. It's me, then Sonia, then Wibbenmeyer, then Christine, then Josh. Okay, does that sound good? We'll give it another minute or so. See if we should.
You guys have no access.
I know.
Ever.
It's
Like a flag up there.
Can somebody try and say something over the Zoom, please?
Testing.
Hi, good morning.
They're real late.
Yeah, because it's main.
Just turn it up to 11.
Yeah.
Try again. Guys.
Say something again, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I can hear everyone.
Testing. Okay. I think that's good. Yeah.
All right. So I guess you guys online can't see unless I share my screen, and then I would stop and make you all co-hosts. Okay. Let's see. I'm doing this for a couple of years. I should have this figured out by now. All right, can you guys see that online? All right, I'm like.
Yep.
Tell me if you like see presentation mode though when it goes. Do you see the presentation mode or do you see the screen? No.
No, just the screen.
Oh, okay, perfect. All right, so I'll kick this off. My name's Jude Bam. This is work collaborative with Marissa Lee at Colorado, who recently graduated from Colorado State, and Cal Bryan, who's a PhD student there. Want to acknowledge USDA, Forest Service, Rocky Mountain Research Station funds. Want to just get right into it. So what usually happens when a wildland fire starts? You know, largely in the US, this is how the US system operates. There's an assessment, sort of whoever gets there first initially. And then pretty immediately planning starts, right? So this is an example of a briefing well into an incident, but you can see the complexity of things going on. There really needs to be a lot of planning going on. And so what is that planning is going to entail an assessment of values at risk, homes being one of the obvious ones. Fuels, topography, sort of, you know, what's going on, how, all these things that we would expect to influence fire behavior, and then opportunities. So opportunities for where to start constructing line, where to attack the fire. Okay, so this is just some context for what we're going to be looking at in this paper. So effort that several in the Forest Service, Matt Thompson, Dave Calkin, Chris Dunn, other collaborators at CSU and Oregon State have been developing this this product or this process they call potential operating delineations, or PODs for short. Okay, so really what this is a planning session that's going to occur before the fire happens, and that seems pretty obvious, like that should be done, but fire has often been treated as this sort of response emergency. Everyone's its own little special flower, and then they get their own attention. But so the idea here being, let's bring all of these people together who would would be working on that planning process while the fire was going, while time is very scarce, and you know, you don't want to waste any time. So let's get everybody together and look at products. You can kind of see this map here has some red and green. This is a suppression difficulty index. It's a product that Kit O'Connor creates for the whole US. And so it's sort of bringing the data-driven analytics to the same place or the same meeting with fire operations folks. So they're going to get together, look at a map, try to identify where they can set operating delineations or where they think they have the best shot at stopping fire. And then they're going to draw these all over a map. So this is the Tonto Forest near Phoenix, Arizona, in the Southwest. And then once they draw all those boundaries, I can probably take this off, I guess, huh? Once they draw all these boundaries, they're going to color code them. And really, I just want to highlight that some of these are purple, where they're rated sort of exclude, and red with protect. But the yellow and green are maintain and restore. So the idea being is that fire's okay there. There's not a whole lot of values at risk. We can accept some fire burning there. And so this led to a research question, you know, really, does this planning matter? Do pods matter? And more precisely, something we can actually try to test is, do fires that occur in these forests that have undergone this pod process systematically differ from similar non-pod fires, okay, in outcomes that we can measure? And is there any evidence that these fires are managed differently?
Hey,
And we
Jude, sorry.
might think that you know, fires that occur in those like restore zones or those green and yellow zones, they might be managed less aggressively. So you put fewer firefighters in, you know, in what we'd call direct attack. You might actually just sort of monitor the fire's progression, work on building line in other areas where you think you have a good shot. So we're going to take two, you know, this certainly isn't mixed methods, but it's sort of an attempt at that. Quantitative and qualitative approaches. So quantitative, it's going to be a matching method. So we're going to identify these fires that have occurred in these forests that have done pod planning, try to find similar fires that were not sort of operated under this, had not done this pod planning. Okay, I'm going to use some propensity score matching. And then look at comments from written status reports and try to understand or see if we can tease any information out of those qualitative summaries.
Hey, Jude, sorry. We're not seeing your slides online. We're not seeing them advanced. We're still.
Oh, you're not at all. All right. Thank you, Matt. Let me just try to reshare. How about now?
We're still on we're not in presentation mode.
Yeah, okay. Let me go back to presentation mode. All right, what do you see now?
We can see the presentation mode, but it's also showing the next slide. That's okay though.
Yeah,
That's
just
that's
ignore
fine.
that. I don't know how else to do it. All right, so here's the data. This is really focused on the southwestern region, so New Mexico, Arizona, largely because there aren't that many forests that have gone through this pod process. So one of the limitations of this study is we have really small numbers, unfortunately. So we have data from these fires, the P code expenditures. This is the Forest Service billing system, so we can get accurate assessments of the cost of these fires. ICS 209 reports, where we're going to get some of that status information from. Preparedness level is a rating that is done regionally and nationally to give a sense for how many resources are committed across the system. Okay, we're going to critically, we're going to do this propensity score matching on conditions before the fire starts, right? So obviously fires are going to progress and they're influenced by human activity and suppression. But here we're going to match on fires on conditions, weather conditions, slope, elevation, topography before the fire starts. So either things that aren't changing or things that are going to be before the fire. So that's critical to our sort of assessment here. You can just look at unconditional means here. This top row is the pod fire. So fires that occurred in these pod forests, and then the bottom row is our average. So we can see the N, we only have 16 fires that have occurred in these pod forests and 24 sort of matches that also had sufficient P code data. And so just going to run through the whole thing, caveats about small sample size. But we can see here some evidence that the final fire size might be a little smaller, a little shorter in duration on average. Cost seems to be lower, and notably cost per acre is lower for these pod fires. But we'll I also wanted to throw in the sort of assessing balance. You can see it's okay on some of these metrics. Elevation looks a little off. We'd like to see these in that 45-degree line band. It's a little dancing all over the place. So, okay, here's the main result table. So this is the regression conditional on all those matching covariates. And really the unfortunate story here is the variation just drowns out any kind of effect. I mean, there seems to be some effect in the unconditional comparisons, just the means, but some very weak statistical significance in that cost per acre. And that's kind of, I guess fortunately one of the only factors where the hypothesis is pretty clear that we should expect less intensive management, less effort per acre, and so less cost per acre. Okay, and then on the qualitative, we have pod fires, some of the remarks. Continue hand and aerial ignitions within the planned area. So reference to these planned areas, continue burnout operations along the road system. So these pre-identified features with non-pod fires, a lot of scouting. So looking for these features. So time and effort spent trying to identify these features to actually engage in operations. Okay. And then actually one of the questions the Forest Service really wanted to know was, can we use managed fire as a substitute for prescribed or mechanical treatments? And so we just did a cost comparison here. Cost per acre, mean across a lot of our pod, non-pod sample, but also prescribed and mechanical treatments that are recorded in the Forest Service database. And we can see, if you just look at the comparisons, the pod fires, the mean is lower, that cost per acre, and pretty similar to prescribed fires. Mechanical thinning, we know, is a lot more expensive. Non-pod fire, a lot more effort in home protection, things like that, that aren't necessarily going to help stop the extent of the fire. Okay, so preliminary results suggest this pod process influences management. Unclear if suppression costs are truly lower or not. We're actively expanding this data set. So fortunately, each year we delay publication on this, we get another year of data. So we're hopeful with increased sample size, we'll get a little bit more clarity here. All right. Okay, I'll maybe do one question and I don't want to use too much time. Yeah.
On your propensity score matching, I didn't see fuel load. Again, how are you adjusting for fuel variance?
So we do have it's a fuel model. So we just say the type of fuel. There's not a very good comprehensive measure of like what the load would be. So
You know more better than I do, but I'm just
yeah, so we have fuel model, which would give, and one of the reasons we restricted this to the Southwest region is most of that region is going to look similar. Yeah. All right. So I will end and say thank you to everyone. All right, and I'll stop sharing. So hopefully, I think Sonia, I think you're up. Are you
Hi,
able to share?
I'm trying to share, but it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
All right, let me see. I think I'm supposed to be able to like make you co-host. All right. Sorry, I should have done this before. Try now, Sonia.
Yeah, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Hi, good morning, everyone from Australia. So this study is about Australia and it's about recovery after a large scale forest fire. So in this study, I try to analyze how different socioeconomic groups who live in different locations recover after a wildfire. So I'd like to acknowledge the funder of this study, which is the Ministry of Education of Singapore, and my research assistant, Homar Pakkalinawan. And my name is Sonia Akhtar. I'm assistant professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of the National University of Singapore. So in 2019-2020, Australia experienced a large-scale wildfire, which is the most catastrophic in the history. So it caused a lot of damage of property, a lot of damage of human lives, and also wild animals. So there are some studies that look at this economic damage and what happened immediately after the fire struck. But there are not many studies that look at recovery from wildfire in Australia and also internationally. And there are some qualitative studies which are very small scale. And there are other studies in the literature that look at recoveries from natural disaster after large scale flooding or a cyclone. There's lots of studies in the US on recovery after Hurricane Katrina. So those studies show that recovery varies across space, across socioeconomic groups, and over time. And also the intersectionality of these three factors, that across space over time, as well as across socioeconomic groups. But currently there is no study that looks at recovery after a large-scale fire and how this recovery varies across space over time and socioeconomic groups. So one reason we don't see that many quantitative large-scale studies is because of the nature of the geographical area where fire occurs. So in most cases, fires occurs in areas where not many people live, so areas that are sparsely populated. And that's why the recovery studies don't usually have a large number of observations that you can use to do a quasi-experiment type of study. But one exceptional feature of the 2019-2020 fire, which is also called the Black Summer Fire of Australia, was that large area of urban major city or inner regional area was affected by that fire. So this is a map of the two states that were most affected by the Black Summer Fire in Australia. So these two states one is New South Wales, one is Victoria. So they're located in the southeast part of Australia. So in Victoria, as you can see, this is Melbourne City, and these are all the areas that were affected in rural areas. So these are very rural or very rural areas. And these are very severely affected areas. But in New South Wales, this is Sydney. As you can see that there is some areas which are much closer to Sydney, but were very badly affected during the fire. So this gives us the opportunity to do a study using nightlight data, because these areas are not that sparsely populated as in the areas that are rural or very rural. So that's why I limit the scope of my study to New South Wales, and I limit take data and observations from areas that are closer to Sydney, which is classified as major city or an inner regional New South Wales, where they're relatively more densely populated than rural and very rural areas. So the research question I study using this data is, over a year after the Black Summer fires, are communities back to where they started from? And whether this pace of recovery varies spatially, and whether there is heterogeneity in recovery across economic capacity. Economic capacity is measured based on economic resources. And does the pace of recovery vary over time? And whether the intersectionality of these three factors, space, time, and socioeconomic characteristics, matter in recovery from wildfire. So I'm using night slice data. So there's another objective of the study is to see whether night slice data can be useful to study or analyze recovery after a fire. So in case of other natural hazards like flooding, earthquake, cyclones, night slice data have been used. But for wildfire, night slice data have not yet been used. And the reason is being, as I mentioned, that fires occur in rural, very rural forested areas where not many people live, and night slice data don't do very well when they are collected from rural areas because they don't reflect the activities very accurately. So I'm using monthly night slice data, and the duration of the data is January 2017 to June 2021. And the unit of my analysis is mesh block, which is the lowest geographical unit in Australia. So this mesh block is like a village where around 30 to 60 households live. And so the reason why I wanted to check whether night slice data is a useful way to understand recovery from after a wildfire is because the data collection is very quick. So you don't have to wait for many years for the census data to become available, or even you don't have to do primary survey, which is usually a very slow moving and it's quite expensive. Okay, so for wildfire extent and severity data, I'm using an official source, which is the fire extent and severity mapping and data from Department of Planning and Industry and Government of New South Wales. So this is the New South Wales government data, which they compiled using remote sensing and satellite data, and also the rural fire service data. So they also classify the data based on burn severity, whether the burn severity is low, moderate, high, or extreme. And one advantage of this data is that it's also, they verified the data using field level data, and the accuracy rate is pretty high for the data. So I'm using this data and the night slice data, combining these two data sources. I want to check whether there is how much night slice data vary over time and across the fire affected area. So these are the locations for my study. So as I mentioned, for very remote areas, the night slice data is not an accurate proxy for economic activity. So I'm also taking areas that are limiting the scope of my analysis to areas that are within up to 10 kilometers from a directly affected site. And I'm using a difference in difference method to compare affected and unaffected areas that are located within this geographical area. So this is my model specification. It's a very standard difference in difference specification. I'm also controlling for COVID-19 cases in the local government unit, and I'm also controlling for fixed effects at a relatively higher geographical area, which is called SA3, which is a combination of 50 or so mesh blocks. So in my specification, I have treatment groups, which is the affected groups, fire affected groups. Post is the time period, which is after the fire season of 2019, 2020, 21. And in my main specification, I've excluded August 2019 to March 2020, which is the time frame when the fire occurred. I've excluded this area to avoid any confounding effect from the forest fire. But then for robustness checking, I have also included this time frame later and check whether the exclusion and inclusion make any difference in my results. Now, in terms of selecting which is my treatment group and control group, I have used different types of rules. So for example, treatment in my main specification, I have decided treatment as those mesh blocks that were directly affected. But later I also checked whether there's a spillover effect by expanding this area to 2 kilometers and 5 kilometers. Okay, going to my main results. So these are the main results, and I find that and here I'm using only the directly affected mesh blocks as my treatment site. And I find that both major cities and inner regions, there is a significant drop in nightlife luminosity 1 year after the fire. And in terms of extent, this is around 30% less than the controlled area. Then next, I check whether there is a spillover effect by expanding the treatment area to 2 kilometers to 5 kilometers of a directly affected mesh block. And I find that for both major city and inner region, the effect of the fire remains visible up to 2 kilometers from the directly affected site. But when I go beyond up to 5 kilometers, in major cities, the effect disappears, but in inner region, the effect still remains quite significant. Okay, then I look at whether these effects, so I run a triple difference model and using the socioeconomic characteristics defined as poverty. So I use census data which classifies areas based on their socioeconomic characteristics and classifies them into deciles. So I take the top 5 deciles, define them as poverty, and the bottom 5 deciles as non-poor region. So I find that the difference in poverty, socioeconomic characteristics matters only in major cities, but in inner regions, there is no difference in nightlight luminosity based on the socioeconomic characteristics. So graphically, I also look at what is happening over time. So as you can see that after the fire, the luminosity drops most in the second quarter, but then it comes back, it improves, and it's this after 5 quarters that the drop is not really significant at the 5% level for major cities. But for inner region, as you can see that the luminosity drops and it keeps dropping and remains quite significant even after 5 quarters after the actual wildfire. So this is the difference between luminosity in affected and unaffected region across time and across socioeconomic characteristics for 2 different groups, major cities and inner regions. And we find that the poorer people in major cities actually experience a larger drop in luminosity, and they also recover over time. But in inner region, you see that the difference between the poor and non-poor communities actually disappears over time. And after quarter 5 of the main fire, they are both significantly lower than their the luminosity level before the fire. So in conclusion, what we find is that wildfire cause immediate damage, but they also cause longer term loss of GDP because of a drop in economic activity. And we find that economic activity recovery actually varied over time across space and socioeconomic groups. And that the difference might be because And the difference might be caused by fire extent in inner regions, much larger than major cities. And in major cities, people have access to support services, where in inner regions, people didn't have access to government support services as much. And most importantly, perhaps because livelihoods in inner regions are more natural resource dependent than in major cities. That's why major city population bounced back more quickly. So this is the preliminary findings, and I'm working on my future research direction is to use census data from Australian Bureau of Statistics and to check whether these data from census actually match the findings from the nightlights. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thank you. All right, so I guess for questions, I'll try to just relay. Anyone have any questions for Sonia? Sonia, I had one question, and you know, I don't know how much of this intuition translates from the US to the Australian context, but suppression effort is usually directed, you know, to protect like valuable assets that, you know, certainly in the US, and I would assume to some extent in Australia as well. So how might that affect your treatment comparison and yeah, I guess what implications might that have for the diff and diff?
But because I'm doing the difference in difference analysis separately for major cities and inner regions, I don't think that would make a big difference because the valuable assets are located in major cities. And in inner regions, most of the properties are very similar in values. So the difference would make the protection of valuable versus non-valuable resources, and also how much resource you deploy to suppress fire varies across regions. So there's a previous study I conducted using similar data and understanding exposure to wildfire of the Black Summer fire. And there I find that there's a big difference in rich areas versus poor areas in terms of exposure. So rich areas were less exposed to fires because of the suppression activities after the fire, and whereas poor areas experienced a severe burn and fire extent. And we explained that using the fire suppression activities and how much resources were deployed to different areas. But in terms of the recovery, I'm not sure whether that has a direct implication, but it's something
Okay.
I can think about. Yeah.
So it's your cells, your unit of analysis, like within that, where the fire stops is as good as random. It's sort of the implicit assumption, right?
That's the assumption. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you. I guess stop sharing and we'll move on to, I think Matt is next.
Jude, have you
I thought
maybe host? Oh, maybe you have.
I did one thing right. I've tried to max it out. Yeah. Matt, see if you can yell when you're presenting.
Am I quiet? Okay.
Well, it's just it's not super clear on this side.
Let's see. How do I do this? Can you all see my screen?
Yes, now we can.
Great. Okay, so it's great to be here virtually. Sorry, I can't be there in person. But this is work with Margaret Walls, also at RFF, on local economic impacts of wildfires. I also want to acknowledge we have had research assistance from RFF research analyst Isabel Rabideau on this project, and this project is funded by the USDA NEPA AFRI program. So just briefly to motivate this, I'm sure many of you have seen something like this. So damages due to wildfires are increasing as part of this trend of increasingly severe and damaging wildfires. And in the and in California, 15 of the top 20 most damaging fires in state history have occurred since 2015. But the local economic impacts of disasters like wildfires are theoretically ambiguous. And that's because disasters impact both the supply and the demand of labor and goods and services. And so it's unclear, given that they sort of impact both sides of the market, what's going to happen to local economies. And consistent with that, evidence from previous literature on effects of disasters on local economies is mixed. So studies that have looked at sort of broader areas focusing on hurricanes, for example, using county level data, have found increases in earnings after hurricanes. And then studies that have used more micro data, establishment level data, focusing on areas directly impacted by hurricanes, have found decreased survival rates in areas affected by severe storms. In the case of wildfires, there's relatively little evidence on the relatively few studies on the local economic impacts of wildfires. There was a study in 2020 looking at the 2018 California wildfires that found that those fires resulted in about $90 billion in indirect economic losses. That study used InPlan. There are also some empirical studies using county level data, and those studies have found short-run positive impacts on employment growth in rural areas. Those studies are mostly focused on large but not necessarily damaging fires. And a recent paper by Taryn Wilson found no effects on employment, wages, and population growth and income, but fires were a very small percentage of the declared disasters in their data. So this is kind of the literature that we're going to be trying to contribute to. And in this paper, our goal is going to be to investigate impacts of specifically destructive wildfires on local economic outcomes, jobs, establishments, and wage income. And we're going to do this with two approaches. We're going to use county level regressions. This is quarterly BLS data coupled with data on percentage of the county population burned. And I'm actually going to sort of skip through the county level regressions for the sake of time. But we use this sort of similar intuition in our measurement of fires in the second approach. So I'll talk a little bit about that when I get to talking about that approach. But the second approach is to use event steady regressions with annual microdata. And so this is going to be establishment level data, and we're going to compare areas very close to large and damaging wildfires and within large and damaging wildfires to areas further away from the wildfire. So this is sort of similar in spirit to Sonia's paper. So I'm actually just going to skip through the county level regressions because it's a little less exciting. But this is kind of indication of our results. We don't find much action in terms of effects of fires on all industries, but the sort of exception when we look at particular industries is effects on the construction industry. But I'll leave it at that for this slide. That analysis that we do at the county level, though, does motivate the second approach, which is using establishment level data. And our establishment data is coming from the National Establishment Time Series, which is, again, this is establishment level microdata. It comes from Dun & Bradstreet data. We have the 2019 edition. And so we observe 71 million establishments from 1990 to 2019. We see their locations, the industry down to the 8-digit SIC code, and the number of employees within each establishment. And then as an outcome variable, we're looking at whether these establishments are close to recent wildfires. And in particular, we want to focus on large and damaging wildfires, fires that were not just burning out sort of in remote areas, but fires that actually were impacting communities, because we think that those are most likely to have caused some kind of local economic impact, whether positive or negative. So we identify, what we do is identify damaging fires, looking at the top 30 fires in terms of population burned, years 1990 to 2013. So what do I mean by population burned? So this is basically we take fire perimeters from the Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity project. We overlay them with census blocks, and using the intersected areas between the fire perimeters and the census blocks, and assuming that populations are uniformly distributed within census blocks, we can calculate the sort of population burned within the perimeter of each fire. Probably this is an overestimate of the population living in homes that were directly impacted by these fires, but we think it's sort of a rough proxy for how damaging each of these fires should have been. So here are what these fires look like across the Western United States and in California in particular. The top 30 fires are going to be our treatment fires. These are the fires in red. Of these top 30 fires, 27 of them are in California, and only 3 are outside the state of California in Colorado and New Mexico. And then the other fires in orange are the top 150 fires from 1990 to 2018, and I'll talk about how we use those on the next slide. So what we're going to do in this second part of this paper is we create 16 square kilometer hexagonal cells across the landscape of the Western United States. And then we aggregate our establishment level data up to this 16 square kilometer cell level. Then we assign each of these cells to be treatment or control cells for various fires, depending on their distance from the fires. So treatment cells are going to be within 6 kilometers from the fire perimeter of one of these top 30 fires. And then control cells are 15 to 25 kilometers away. We have this concern that cells may be treated by other fires. As you saw in the previous slide, many of our top 30 fires were clustered in Southern California, where there were a lot of other large fires around, including top 30 and top 150 fires. So what we do then is we drop cells that are within six kilometers of any of the top 150 fires within 5 years before or after the treatment fire. Then we collect our treatment and control cells into a pooled panel data set, and each observation in the data set is a treatment and or control cell year for a specific fire event. And based on how we construct the data set, we know that that cell year is not treated by other nearby fires within 5 years. So this is what these cells look like. The fire on the left is the Cerro Grande fire from New Mexico in 2000. This is a very clean example. In fact, it's the only example this clean out of all of our top 30 fires. most of the fires look more like the cedar fire on the right, where we end up having to drop some of the treatment and some of the control cells due to proximity to other fires within 5 years on either side. But we still are able to maintain some cells that were treated or control cells only for this fire, in this case, the cedar fire. So we estimate event study regressions where we regress the growth rate of employment. We've also looked at growth rate in the number of establishments in cell I for fire F from year T-1 to year T on indicators for the year relative to the year of the treatment fire in each year. And then we include cell by fire fixed effects and year by fire fixed effects here. These are cell by fire and year by fire because cells actually can appear in the data set more than once. For example, if they're a treatment cell for a fire that's very early in the sample period and a control cell for a fire that's later in the sample period. Some summary statistics for our treatment and control cells. So we have in total 535 treatment cells and about 1,200 control cells. The control cells have tend to be in more populated areas and have a greater number of establishments and more employment. So we do have some concerns about balance, which we'd like to try to address in some future work, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But just moving to the results here. So this is an event study figure for overall employment growth. And what we find here is pretty much no effect. We do see what look like decent pre-trends or lack of pre-trends prior to the year before the fire occurs, which is the omitted year. But then we don't see much effect in on overall employment growth from comparing treatment cells to control cells in the years following the fire. That's true for growth in the number of establishments as well. We don't see much action. Looking at the construction industry, which I briefly showed that we did see some effects using the county level data there. We do see an uptick in construction industry employment growth in the year of the fire in treatment cells as compared to control cells. It's not significant at the 5% level, but it's close. And it's a fairly sizable effect in terms of economic significance. This is a 4 percentage point uptick in construction industry employment growth compared to a base rate of growth of about 3 percentage points. In the ag industry, the story is actually opposite. We're seeing a decline in employment growth in the year of the fire, and then sort of returning to normal levels of growth thereafter. We looked at a lot of other industries. These were really the ones that stood out. Most of the other industries, there's really not a lot going on. So just to summarize our findings here, in our county level analysis, we found no significant effect of fires on overall employment, establishments, and wage income growth in the short or long run. And that was even using a measure of wildfire activity that accounts for destructiveness. The exception was the construction sector, where we did see a short run increase in employment, but that effect dissipated after about 1.5 years. In our cell level results, we found no effects on overall average employment growth rates, but we do see marginally significant short-run positive effects on construction sector employment and negative effects on agricultural sector growth, but no effects in other industries. One caveat I do want to add here, though, is that our data do only, for the cell level analysis, our data do only run to 2013. And so it's entirely possible that negative impacts of fires may be concentrated around the most destructive wildfires, for example, the Camp Fire, and some of the other highly damaging fires that have occurred in recent years, and those fires are not included in our sample here. So in terms of additional analyses and next steps, so we intend to look at births, deaths, expansions, and contractions because these changes in employment may conceal large changes in job flows. So, so just because we observe net zero effect, there could be things going on in terms of churn. We also, in order to address some of the balance concerns, we're considering exploring using some matching to just using the data set as we've constructed, pair treatment cells with control cells that are most similar in terms of some of their observable characteristics like number of establishments, et cetera. And then we can also explore alternative treatment and control distances as well. So I'll end there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Matt. Any questions? Yep.
So did you look at all at quarterly effects? Because those first 4 months after a wildfire, critical. And you'll see, I've lived through 3 of those fires in real life. And those first 4 months are really critical. Do you guys look at all at looking at it instead of a year-long period, but looking at it in quarters instead? You're going to see that from the data?
Matt, did you hear that?
Yeah, I think I heard most of it. So in our county level analysis, we're using the quarterly census of earnings and wages from the BLS. So the advantage of that data is it does allow us to get some more temporal resolution to get at some of those effects that you're bringing up here. The trade-off when we move to the establishment level data is that we have sort of better spatial resolution on where these impacts are, but that data is only observed annually. So we really can't look at some of the shorter term impacts, unfortunately, using that data. So we're kind of, that's one of the reasons we want to use both of these analyses in this paper to sort of, because there does exist this trade-off between these 2 data sources. Unfortunately, neither of these data sets kind of is a silver bullet.
Yeah. Okay.
And did you also look at seasonality or weather patterns and potential covariates? Because a lot of times the effects of fire last longer than the period of fire because of a lot of times you'll have heavy rains that come through and then suddenly your mudslides from destabilization and whatnot. And so that recovery gets pushed out a little bit more. Could that potentially be an alternative variable for capturing that at all?
Matt, did you hear that?
Can you say it back?
Yeah, so she was highlighting the fact that there may be subsequent like events like landslides after the year or the 6 months after the fire occurs or something like that. And so might that lead to events after the actual fire, but might still sort of fit within your event study? Could that be a factor, or did you look at controlling for that maybe?
Yeah, we haven't included any kind of controls for that sort of thing. If you have ideas about what we might use for that, I'd love to hear them. I think that it's entirely possible that if there were sort of weather events or the fire lasted for a very long time, it could sort of carry over, especially when we're looking at that quarterly level data. It's probably somewhat less likely when we're using the annual data, but still possible there too, given the timing of fire seasons, particularly fires that occur late in the calendar year.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, Matt, I had a quick question, and I guess it's more of a reaction to those results. The cell-based, like the lack of that strong result for construction with the cell-based didn't surprise me all that much, because I think you're looking at establishment location, right? But if that industry is, you know, sort of surging to rebuild after a fire, it doesn't really matter where the construction company's located. And maybe that's why you see it so much stronger in the census, the quarterly census data.
That's a great point.
Yeah, okay. Cool. That was really neat. So thanks, Matt.
Thanks.
Sorry, Christine might not be on, huh? All right. Jocelyn, I guess that's you. Oh, I might have to make you a. No, maybe I did.
Can you see those?
Yeah.
Okay.
And go and don't be shy. Talk loud. It's quiet on this side.
Okay, will do. So yeah, I'll be talking today about housing assessments and wildfire risk. And the motivation for this is state and local governments spend a surprisingly large amount on wildland firefighting. So between 2000 and 2001, California budgeted around $3 billion to their wildfire funds. Washington and Oregon also around 2020 budgeted between 125 and 171 million towards their state level wildfire funds. And so we hear a lot about the federal government being the major player in the wildland fire space, but state governments and especially local governments actually end up carrying a pretty large burden of the firefighting cost as well. And the main reason for that is the local fire districts have the first responsibility for fire protection. So if we see a fire that starts near a small community, most likely the first groups on scene at that community would be the rural fire department. Naturally, if it starts on a federal land and then moves to threatened rural, well, then those rural fire departments might also be called on to do more structure protection type work because those rural fire departments might be more trained in actual structure firefighting, whereas the federal government agencies tend to focus more on structure protection as opposed to putting out a fire that's actively involved. And so then the state and local governments, they have a variety of different ways that they can fund this wildfire protection services. The first that you might think of would be federal grants. Where I'm from at Whitman County, federal grants make up about 3% of the fire and ambulance budget. So it's a pretty small component, but some counties, I'm sure that's much larger. Other options are to do, county level taxes or state level taxes on, all individuals in the county or in the state in order to pay for wildfire firefighting services. And some states have tried to do more targeted taxes in that. And so California between 2011 and 2017 actually had a fee per structure that they charged homeowners that were in the state responsibility area. So those areas of the state of California that CAL FIRE had a primary responsibility to protect. And so those homeowners faced an additional fee. Naturally, it wasn't very popular, and they've been basically suspending it since 2017. And so that is not currently in effect. The state of Montana has a fee that is charged to certain landowners, especially individuals who live in more rural areas that have forested land. And Montana has charged that fee for a number of years. Now, what I'm curious about is, are there any existing taxes that are actually based on fire risk? So are we charging, basically everyone in there? But as we know, fire risk doesn't affect everyone equally. There's some people that may have homes in much higher fire risk areas than others. And so what is the determining factor in that? Or do some counties or some states price or penalize individuals who live more in high fire risk areas more than others? And so just a little quick background on wildfire funding in the United States. The federal government is the largest provider of wildland firefighting services. And as Bayless and Blumhauer pointed out, that federal firefighting expenditures are larger than the supplemental assistance for needy families programs for a couple of Western states. And part of this is the federal government is fiscally responsible for fires that begin or threaten on federal lands. However, state and local governments also have some responsibility for structure protection, especially for structures that are built on private land. And there's some mixed incentives here because state and local governments make the zoning decisions that allow for development in these high fire risk areas. And as Bayless and Blumhauer point out, that there might be a moral hazard issue there with states possibly allowing, or counties allowing, development in high fire risk areas. And so this kind of ambiguity from the local government standpoint is, well, on one hand, they can allow development in high fire risk areas and receive tax benefits from being able to leverage property taxes or increase community growth and increase tax revenues from development in the wildland urban interface. But when a wildfire actually occurs, this can have a negative or ambiguous effect on the actual local government's finances. They might receive an initial boost if a fire goes through and destroys a lot of buildings, because there'll be people paying for building permits. But there also may be, as Matt mentioned earlier, there are losses in unemployment or other forms of revenue that the local government might depend on as a revenue stream. And so regardless of this, development in the wildland urban interface requires some sort of additional fire protection service. If you expand a city or expand a small town and build in an area that you haven't built before, you're going to need fire protection services for that area. And so that's going to require at least some outlay from the state or local government to pay for fire protection in those areas. And so the research question that I look at here is, do state or local governments actually charge higher taxes for homes that are built in fire-prone areas? And so the way that I'll test this is basically look at, is there a change in the assessed value of a house based on fire risk? So if we're looking at a landscape and there's a number of different structures out there, does the individual that's on or in a more risky location within the same county pay higher taxes if all else is held equal? And so there's a couple of different ways that local governments could do this. They could simply levy an additional tax. They could charge a fire protection fee, so to speak, on homes that are built in the wildland urban interface, just as an additional dollar amount, maybe a flat fee or progressive, by levying additional taxes. That might be more difficult than possibly a different route, which would be, well, it's been shown that homes in high fire risk areas often have higher amenity values. People enjoy living in the woods. So maybe tax assessments would be higher in those areas as well. And so that's another possible way that they could charge a risk premium on top of whatever the amenity value gain would be from living in a high fire risk area. And so to test this, use a couple of different data sets. Landfire has a bunch of different iterations of fire risk data, the 270 meter grid level. And then property assessment or property tax assessment. I've been fortunate to be working with the Z-Trax data from Zillow. Unfortunately, they're suspending that program. And so I'll have to find another source to if it takes too long to get this out. And luckily, there's several states that have pretty transparent county assessor data that I've been able to pull through. And then so to get to the actual methods here, I'm going to do it in a couple of different stages. So for the first pass, I use a random forest model to basically just pick out what are the most important characteristics for a housing sale. And so then I take those 10 those 10 variables with the highest predictive power and use those in an OLS regression with sales price as the dependent variable. And then after I run that regression, I use that same sales price in a county assessment model where the assessed value is based on sales price as well as a bunch of county characteristics, and then also the wildfire risk level. Now, the way that I do this 2SLS process is I'm really curious or concerned, I guess, about the spillover effect from homes in high amenity value areas kind of skewing the assessment up. And so I'm curious if there's an additional penalty that those homeowners pay. So not just living in not having a very expensive home because there's high amenity values, but also having to pay a higher assessed value as a way of the county compensating for the increased fire risk that comes with that. And so I'll report just a couple of estimates here for counties in Colorado, and find that there's actually quite a bit of variability in how fire risk is actually taxed between counties. So the left-hand column there is the change in assessed value, or the marginal effect of fire risk on assessed value. This is just in dollars. So if your fire risk goes up by a unit, this is normalized off of the land fire data risk unit. So it's I would say pretty close to a scale from say 0 to 100. So the more risky you are, the higher your assessed value would increase there. The right-hand columns are the change in your actual property taxes based on those additional units of fire risk. And so as we can see, there's actually a couple of counties, or at least one county, that appears to subsidize wildfire risk. So if you live in a high fire risk area, you actually end up paying the county less in taxes than a comparable home in a low fire risk area. Now, I know we have a couple of folks from Colorado in there, so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this as well. But one of the things that I've noticed just from looking at both the Colorado data as well as some in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, is that it tends to be counties that are more developed or higher population and higher income that have a greater penalty for these homes in high fire risk areas, and counties that are more rural and lower income tend to have no effect or possibly ambiguous, or possible subsidies, excuse me, on wildfire risk. So there's a few other steps that I'll hope to take down the line looking at this, but it's kind of the first pass that I have. And so in conclusion, the preliminary results show that the taxing approach to wildfire differs significantly between county. But more importantly than that, there's some counties that appear to actually be subsidizing development in this high fire risk area. And so I think that's an area that needs future work. And it also seems like larger counties, possibly because they have the ability to, care about wildfire risk and worry about it more, and have a large enough staff that they can actually go out and examine that as a factor, tend to place more of an emphasis on fire risk. And so with that, I'll open up to questions.
All right, thanks, Josh. All right, any questions? Yep.
Because you're not thought that instead of the tax, we've seen it happen in the homeowner that it's changed over the homeowner.
Yeah.
But they price insurance so high that it's impossible to insure your home anymore. And that sometimes forces people out.
Right. Yeah, Josh, did you hear that?
No, I really didn't, sorry.
Okay, the question was, did you account for insurance rates, really? Because in California, at least, a lot of this gets capitalized into insurance rates.
Yeah, no, I have not yet. If you know a good source for insurance premium data, I would love to see that. That's something I've been curious about for quite a while, and I think would be important to capture in this.
Yeah.
Just trying to get that. Out of the homeowner insurance is really hard now.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, no, there was just echoing Josh that, yes, it's hard to get that info. Who is it, like CoreLogic might be your best bet actually on that. I haven't talked to them specifically about this, but oh, Matt, yeah, just chime in.
I had two kind of related comments. So one, I think it would be interesting here because presumably counties have formulas and rules that they use to determine assessed values. So looking at precisely what those are and how that relates to what you're finding here, I think would be important. And then the second comment is, so I think that part of what you are picking up could be, so like in some counties, rural areas are like poorer and the housing stock may be lower value, and in other areas maybe like more kind of amenity driven areas with more amenity driven development, the property values are going to be higher. So I guess I in order to say that this is like taxing or subsidizing fire risk, I think you might have to like think about disentangling what you're finding from some of those other effects.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Yeah, so I played around with a few different functional forms of it, and my first pass at this actually was just to run a random forest regression, just trying to back out the county assessor's model. And the main difficulty I had with that was you end up with that same problem that we all kind of fight with, where you get amenity values highly correlated with fire risk. And so then fire risk becomes, pretty significant in that random forest variable selection model I actually end up using. It was the 11th most important factor if you're just looking at sales price, and I think the 7th or 8th as far as assessment goes. And so I think they definitely have some emphasis on the amenity, but then yeah, trying to find a functional form that will disentangle the two of those, I think.
Josh, I didn't actually see your model slide, but was that just essentially a hedonic model then, and you're using?
Right, just essentially two of them, two hedonic models, one for the assessment values, and then the other as an input for the assessment values just with sales price. So presumably the county hedonic model uses this, what the market value of the home is as one of their factors, just as a way to account for those idiosyncratic factors for a specific house.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
that would be captured if they were just relying on a general formula.
Okay. Well, you sort of indirectly asked me, about whether those Colorado counties made sense to me, and some of them do, but like El Paso is where Colorado Springs is, and they're notorious for not taxing anything actually, or like just being very opposed to taxes. I don't know if that translates into property taxes necessarily, but I was a little surprised to see that was one of the higher ones. They also have had, bad fire near them. And then Larimer, in just our experience, they, and this speaks to Matt's comment about just knowing the local regulations, the person that, I can't remember the title of this person, but the one who determines the property taxes, it was a new person, like starting in 2018, and they just literally pulled a hedonic model off the shelf, and everybody got new reassessments. So, you know, so they were really like just direct predictions out of a model. So I think it just does speak to the local variation and in these, you know, even these counties in Colorado, for instance, all across. But I would also say that Colorado Public Radio called me like 2 months ago asking for exactly this. And I didn't have a good answer. So this is at least a start.
Well, thanks. I appreciate the feedback, everybody.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't see is Christine here? Did she ever log in? No. Did anyone ever see her at all? All right, well, we have some open discussion time if anyone has any additional comments or questions. Or you can leave, I won't be offended. Well, I appreciate you guys logging in and giving your talks. Sorry you weren't here, but
Thanks for wrangling from there.
yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thanks, Jude.
All right. Well, see y'all. Thank you.
We'll see ya.
Thank
Thanks.
you.